Reid, your number 4 seed, already creeping into the Star City Players Championship standings. See, 32nd as of right now.
Which is really shocking because Reid does not play in a bunch of events, but naturally, every time he's competing in them, he's making a very deep run.
All right, Reid will get to be on the play for game run. As you mentioned, these are best of 5, so this game will be unique in that it's the only non-sideboarded game. And Reid's deck flush with creatures, 26 creatures, only 11 spells, 2 of them being whips. So it's just Thought Seizes and Murderous Cuts, and a couple Heroes Downfall for removal.
Which is actually pretty good for Reid in this matchup. I don't think he wants a lot of creature removal.
All right, well, Reid's going to start out with Thoughtseize, so we'll see what Joe's holding at the very least. Joe with certainly a control-style hand here. We see 3 lands, Abzan Charm, Elspeth Sun's Champion, Siege Rhino, and End Hostilities. This was a curve that started at 3.
This is a slow hand for Joe. It's a powerful hand, but one that's susceptible from an explosive start on Reid's side of the table. The Abzan Charm is really the only removal spell in his hand. It's the only thing giving Joe any source of card advantage. If that leaves, then he's left with a cumbersome hand, and if Reid has some sort of explosive opening with Satyr Wayfinders and can get his graveyard action going very quickly, Joe's not left with much of a response.
Oh, we'll see what Reid decides to take here. You mentioned Abzan Charm, the only kill spell. Joe maybe can make his way up to Siege Rhino. Either way, he's going to have to rebuild, as you see Abzan Charm taken. Does have 2 temples to do so, however.
And not surprising for Reid to take the Abzan Charm here. This game's going to go on for a pretty long time. And a flexible removal spell that exiles or something that allows Joe to draw cards, probably the most important card in that hand.
All right, Joe with the Temple of Silence scribes a card to the bottom, just trying to rebuild here. And I guess it'll be on Reid to get some early game pressure. He does have Sylvan Caryatid on turn 2, so this ramps into a lot of his payoff cards, which are at 4.
Most notably, Sidisi Brood Tyrant.
Second scry from Joe, drew his copy of Ugin. So between the 2 Planeswalkers, he has his late game covered, but will he survive to it? That's going to be the question.
Ugin very, very potent against Reid deck. It sounds silly to say because it's an 8-mana Planeswalker. Of course, it's going to be good. But especially against Reid deck, you know, there's no Whisperwood Elemental, there's no Nissa. The type of cards that these big permanent decks play to fire back against a Nissa, Reid does not have access to game 1.
And for Reid, he does have one of his payoffs at 4. It's not Sidisi, however, it's a copy of Whip of Erebos. Makes that on turn 3. So you go over to Joe, and it will be Reid the Bones for him. He's picked that one up as a replacement for Abzan Charm.
And you see this card in the sideboard, a lot of Abzan mid-range decks, and this really indicates that Joe's on the control strategy playing this main. Very powerful in all the mid-range and control matchups.
Yeah, and Joe actually really has recovered here. You see that he drew Courser off that Reid the Bones, also has picked up a copy of BioBlight, so he may actually be able to weather this storm until he gets to cards like Elspeth and Ugin.
Well, it's really important Reid for Reid to get something going with his graveyard here, and you see a Satyr Wayfinder, which is very helpful to that end.
If Wayfinder's going to miss, it does put 4 creatures in the graveyard, though. Sylvan Caryatid, Torrent Elemental, Sidisi Brood Tyrant, and Courser of Krufix. Reid does have the whip in play, so this is not that bad, even though it misses.
Getting the Sidisi also allows him to go again with his graveyard, which is very nice here.
Yeah, Torrent Elemental, that's one of the many one-ofs that Reid is running with the Sidisi Undead Vizier package.
This is a fine card to just cast, and also with his delve action, like the 4 copies of Murderous Cut, he can get it exiled.
Yeah, he can delve it away to exile. He can even actually Whip of Erebos this card to exile it, and then just recast it to have it permanently stick around. So a pair of mana creatures, a Whip of Erebos for Reid. It may be Joe making the first play. We did know there was a Siege Rhino left in his hand from that Thoughtseize. May just be time to jam those 4/5s.
The Torrent Elemental is also not a horrible response to Ugin, as it gets exiled as a result of Ugin's activated power. And it's something that can then pressure Ugin on the follow-up. If Joe's got a lot of removal, that plan doesn't necessarily work, but it is something to keep in mind.
So the first large creature on the board is going to be a Siege Rhino from Joe Bass. Comes into play, puts him up to 19, and Reid down to 14. And we'll see what response the Duke has here. 3 mana up may be a Hero's Downfall.
And the Siege Rhino was looking pretty anemic in Joe's opening hand, as it was just kind of this, random creature in a matchup that's not really about attacking and blocking. But now that Joe has a payoff in Ugin, and he's picked up Reid the Bones, this Siege Rhino potentially buying him a turn or 2 or causing Reid to maybe not attack him for a little while is pretty valuable, because Joe's got a very powerful late game rolled up.
It's fun when you think about Siege Rhino. In this matchup, it's there to buy time. Reid did crack Fetch on end step, but no play there. Just going to go ahead and draw.
Because of the amount of life gain, removal, and blocking in the matchup, it's very unlikely that Joe just carves out with Siege Rhinos and that's good enough to beat Reid. But when Joe has his powerful late game stuff, he has Elspeth, he has Ugin, Siege Rhino buying a lot of time, causing Reid to spend several turns slogging through it or not attacking, that's good for Joe.
I'll go back to Reid. What kind of threat he can finally get on the board. It is going to be an activation of Whip of Erebos, and that will be Sidisi, Brood Tyrant. She'll mill 3 cards. One of them is a creature. Both Satyr Wayfinder and Tassiger hit the graveyard, so he'll get a zombie token. Sidisi will have haste here. Sidisi will swing in, and that will mill 3 more. Another copy of Sidisi Brood Tyrant and one of the Undead Vizier. Second zombie into play. She'll swing into the Siege Rhino. Reid will go up to 16.
Sidisi Undead Vizier, so powerful in the strategy, especially in these kind of matchups that go on for a very long time, where Joe's not going to be really containing Reid's board entirely, and Reid has plenty of powerful singletons to go get.
And I mean, this is actually one of the interesting synergies with the new card. To be able to use the exploitability on Sidisi Undead Vizier, you don't actually have to cast her from your hand. If Reid whips her from the graveyard, he can still sacrifice a creature to that trigger and then go get any card into his hand. For Joe, it's just going to be a card advantage game. Courser of Krufix is the play. He plays a Temple off the top, gaining a life. Sees a second copy of Elspeth. Decides doesn't need a second one of those as he'll scry it to the bottom, setting up Hero's Downfall as his next draw.
And Joe's got a really good setup at this point. He's got End Hostilities and Elspeth in his hand. So End Hostilities says, don't add more to the board. Elspeth says, you need to add more to the board. And the top end of Ugin is powerful no matter what path Reid pursues.
Yeah, it does seem both players are just ramping up toward their late game, and there's going to be some clash of fireworks here to see who ends up on top once they start getting their high-end spells. As we're back over to Reid. 2 zombies, Satyr Wayfinder, Sylvan Caryatid, and a Whip of Erebos. A lot of tools in play, but right now he's not able to push damage at Joe. Joe has remained at 20 life.
At this point, Reid is likely searching for one of his trump cards. You know, he's got some powerful things he can tutor for here. Hornet Queen, Soul of Innistrad, and so forth. But it's very challenging because Reid knows about the Elspeth and knows about the End Hostilities, and both of those kind of put a crimp on his style a little bit.
Yeah, you mentioned these trump cards, but yeah, because he knows about these sweepers, it is interesting to see what he wants, what kind of threat he wants to try to get with Sidisi.
And Joe's going to just put the ball in Reid's court right now. Joe can block, he can kill stuff. He's got a lot of flexible options here, so he can just respond to whatever Reid does. I'm sure Joe is happy to sit here, just build up blockers, develop his card advantage to the Courser of Krufix and his card drawing spells, and say, Reid, you have to do something.
Yeah, I mean, eventually, Joe has this inevitability that when he hits 8 mana, he does get to play Ugin, and Reid's deck doesn't have a clean answer to Ugin exiling everything.
He has to just rebuild with what's left over in his hand, which his deck certainly could do. If Joe plays Ugin and minus it and Reid untaps and casts the Hornet Queen, Reid might be fine.
Hornet Queen certainly one of
Soul
his
of Innistrad,
powerful
another
weapons there, yeah.
example. You know, he can maybe get through it that way, but
for Reid, it will be another Whip of Erebos activation. This one is going to be on Sidisi Brood Tyrant again. So he'll mill 3 more. Hits a Sylvan Caryatid, the zombie will be added to the board. And just the 3/3 will attack again. Another mill off Reid. He's just gaining more card advantage. Mills a Courser, gets a 4th zombie.
And part of this is that Reid doesn't really have a knockout card to go tutor for right now. There's no rush to get the Sidisi back. I mean, possibly the best thing for him to tutor for right now is Thoughtseize, but that's so low impact enough, and I think Reid wants to wait for a spot where he has something very clear and very powerful to go get.
Passes the turn, so Reid gaining 3 life. He continues to send those Sidisis right into Siege Rhino, just making zombies. He has netted 12 cards in his graveyard and 4 zombies off the last 2 turns. As we go over to Joe, draws for the turn. His new card off the top is Caves of Koilos. He'll play that one for free. Now has 6 lands. That's enough to cast the Elspeth that both players know about. Now, with all the milling Reid's doing, and the fact that this game is setting up to go long, does Reid have to worry about milling, basically using up all his high-end threats?
I think that if that comes up, it's a sign that Reid was losing the game anyway. If he needs to go that deep with his graveyard and that deep with Whip of Erebos, and Joe's able to just, stem the tide of all that kind of stuff, it probably means Reid was likely to lose anyway. Because if he wasn't going crazy with his graveyard, he wouldn't have the raw resources to keep up with Joe's side.
All right, well, as both players know, Elspeth Sun's champion is the turn 6 play for Joe. She will make 3 soldiers. And 3 soldiers for Joe will square off against the 4 zombies for Reid. As both sides here with plenty of action.
And Joe just turtling up. He knows he's got a powerful hand. He knows he has an answer in his hand if things get out of control. 2 answers, in fact, with Ugin and End hostilities. So he's just going to hang back, mode up, as you mentioned. The game concludes at the minimum when Reid gets decked. So Joe has no impetus to make a move right now. And just wait.
He doesn't need to win so much as he needs to not lose.
Exactly. And right now he's not losing on the board, and he's got a lot of insurance policies in his hand to ensure that he doesn't lose even if Reid fires up something powerful.
We'll go back over to Reid. Because he's been using Whip of Erebos the last 2 turns, Reid actually with a fairly full grip. Four cards in hand.
And Joe, in fact, with a Bioblade in his hand right now, and not even bothering to take care of the zombies, because right now they can't attack, and they're likely to get swept away whenever Joe makes a big move anyway.
And here is the setup for Reid. He's going to Whip of Erebos back that Torrent Elemental. Wants to take down Elspeth, and that will certainly do it. Torrent Elemental will swing with just... it'll swing with most of the team. So the Torrent Elemental ability will tap all of Joe's blockers. 5 damage will go in to take care of Elspeth, and 7 more from the Wayfinder and 3 zombies puts Joe down to 14. And this inclusion of Torrent Elemental on the list really showing off right here.
It's very powerful when Reid has the Whip of Erebos in play. When he doesn't, Reid has to go through these more cumbersome iterations of put it in my graveyard somehow or have it die somehow, and then Murderous cut it out and then get it back that way, which is slow and susceptible to getting tripped up by even just random things like Hero's Downfall. But as long as the Whip is in play, this is potent and may require Joe to respond.
And Joe at 14. Draws for the turn, he draws a temple, flips the top card, it's Siege Rhino. Joe, though, took 7, but now goes up to 15 again. He's actually going to scry away the Siege Rhino. Urborg is the next land. And I suppose he took a lot of damage that turn, but because that was somewhat of one-shot damage from Torrent Elemental, Joe's still not behind on the board.
And he's generated so much card advantage at this point that Reid's got a very good setup right now of just getting this Torrent Elemental back. But Joe can buy a little bit of time with things like Hero's Downfall, and it's not that bad for him.
Reid drawing again here. What's been impressive is that Reid has not played a card from his hand in the last 3 turns here.
Yeah, he's gone all in on just trying to get as much action going on in his graveyard here. And part of that is a consequence of the end hostilities he knows about in Joe's hand. I think Reid wants to take a path here where Joe's hand gets forced to use end hostilities just to clean up the leftovers from the graveyard, and then Reid can rebuild with the cards that he has left over in his hand.
See, Reid surveying through his graveyard, still has that copy of Sidisi Undead Vizier that he can whip back, along with some lower end creatures, cards like Courser of Crufix and Tassiger. And Reid is going to use the Whip of Erebos again. This is the 4th time really playing around that end hostilities. And this time it's going to be the Undead Vizier he'll go for. So the 4/6 comes into play. Yes, Reid can exploit it. See if Joe wants to respond. Still has that Bioblade you mentioned. Perhaps he wants to take care of the zombie tokens. If he do, he'll force Reid to sack the Wayfinder, but Reid may have been sacking that anyway.
Exactly. I think that Reid at this point wants to just get another thing that he can get back to get more juice in the graveyard. And both the Caryatid and the Wayfinder are expendable enough that it doesn't seem worth using the Bioblade at this stage.
All right, the Wayfinder is sacrificed, so Reid gets to go through his deck for any one card, see what he chooses.
Keep in mind, Joe also has to be concerned about how much he has left over whenever this end hostilities occurs. They're both kind of playing the same game where they know Reid's trying to get to the spot where Joe's hand is forced. Joe is trying to build up enough of a board with inconsequential cards that Reid keeps having to develop into it. And so Joe does want to leave his removal spells, whatever else he can, left over, because he knows eventually he's going to have to use that end hostilities, and he wants to have as many resources left over as possible. So firing off the Bioblight for very little value here, not something that Joe wants to do.
Sidisi will swing, a soldier will block, Reid gaining more life up to 34. Yeah, it feels like they're both playing around with Joe's end hostilities to a point.
Yeah, that's what the focal point of the game is right now. Both players know about it, both players know each other knows about it, and they're playing this song and dance game. Reid trying to expend as little as possible, and Joe trying to get Reid to expend as much as possible.
Temple of Malady from Reid. I believe the card he got off that Sidisi was his copy of Soul of Innistrad.
And that makes a lot of sense because it's a very potent thing to have post-end hostilities, and the game's just shaping up to go on for a very long time regardless. So that in and of itself is a response to a sweeper or anything else Joe really does.
Yeah, and Joe digging in here, he'll on end step just draw 2 with Obzon Charm, goes down to 13, draws a Sandstep Citadel and an Urborg, then draws another land for the turn. That's going to be Llanowar Wastes. And here's some action. Joe finally digs his way into Tasigur, which will be his draw next turn. And at 8 mana, Joe is going to play Ugin the Spirit Dragon. And that play should force some action from Reid.
Definitely. I mean, the board's about to get swept up here. He's no longer going to have access to his Whip of Erebos, at least for the time being. Now, Reid does play 2 midnight copies of Hero's Downfall, so that could be a very easy response here.
Yep, so Ugin goes ahead and minuses 4 to take care of the whole board. And as you mentioned here, Reid is at the ready with his copy of Hero's Downfall. Now, thanks to cards like Tasigur, Joe may be able to rebuild faster here.
It's a very nice draw. There's only 1 Ugin in the deck. Now, in theory, Joe can manipulate the graveyard in such a way to maybe get that Ugin back if he gets very lucky with the Tasigur activations. But the most likely scenario is that's gone for the game.
1 Tasigur down, 1 Elspeth down. Joe does have 2 more copies of Elspeth. I suppose at some point, then you have to ask whether or not, we asked whether Joe could run Reid out of threats. Maybe can Reid run Joe out of threats?
Well, the problem is that Reid can't really do that because, again, Joe can just deck him. So, yeah, Reid's at a high life total. The most likely scenario if Joe wins is that it still involves damage somehow, but Joe does not have to pursue that course if he doesn't want to.
And Reid will cast that Soul of Innistrad that he got off Sidisi. This is the 6/6 for 6 from M15 with Death Touch. The scary ability here is if Reid gets to untap with that and tap 5 mana, he'll get to return up to 3 creatures from his graveyard to hand.
And he's got naturally a lot of good stuff to get back at this point.
This puts a lot of pressure on Joe just to have an answer for the Soul.
Well, the thing is, Joe can also just go ahead and kill this and then use end hostilities on the leftovers. Reid can try to split the difference of getting back, 3 creatures, 1 or 2 of which is powerful to induce and end hostilities, but the Soul of Innistrad is no guarantee anything particularly good happens for Reid. It's the best thing that he's got going at this point, but Joe has so many resources to work with that Joe might be able to just power through this.
So here's the play you were talking about from Joe. So he Heroes Downfalls the Soul of Innistrad, plays Tasigur. He delves away everything except for Ugin and lands and leaves up 4 mana to do it. So if he can mill 2 lands with this Tasigur activation, you said it was a long shot, but the payoff will be huge for Joe Bass.
And the other side of it is now he's just getting really powerful stuff off all the Tasigur activations because Reid can't give him back the Ugin. So it's going to be something else. And, Reid doesn't have any choice in the matter here, essentially.
Yeah, Ugin seems to be the last card that Reid would want to give Joe.
Yeah. It's not clear that Reid could even beat the first Ugin activation in this game, even with Downfall in his hand at the ready. I think a second time is almost certainly a death sentence.
And here's another copy of Sidisi Brood Tyrant for Reid. This is his 3rd copy of the legendary creature. Does mill a Sylvan Caryatid along with one of his murderous cuts. And we'll see him go for Torrent Elemental out of exile. Torrent Elemental exiled with Whip of Erebos many a turn ago. And now we'll go to Joe. He doesn't mill the lands, but he mills 2 copies of Hero's Downfall, so he gets to pick to give him a Hero's Downfall or an Ugin. Easy choice.
I like giving him Hero's Downfall here.
And Joe has 1 copy of Murderous Cut in his deck, so if you wanted to try to re-delve his graveyard to get that Ugin alone, he can't really do it. He would put Murderous Cut in the graveyard with it.
Yeah.
You see, Joe still has 6 cards in hand, it looks like.
Well, he's done very little. You know, he's been able to bleed a lot of resources out of Reid. And in the meantime, has drawn some cards. He's activated Tassiger. Courser Krufix was in play for a while. So Joe is way up on cards.
And Tassiger is going to attack. Reid knows about the hero's downfall. He knows if he goes for the double block that Joe will just get both his creatures. He'll take 4.
Reid's at 32. There's no reason to panic just yet in terms of answering the board.
A land from Joe Bass. And a Siege Rhino. This is his second Siege Rhino. He'll go back up to 17. And it does feel like, because you mentioned Reid is the one who will mill first, he's the one running, that we feel like we're only really watching Joe's life total right now.
It's true, though. You know, Joe's in a position here where he can, I think, start putting on a lot of pressure. He has Downfall in his hand. He's likely in a turn or two to get a Downfall or another removal spell out of his graveyard. Still sitting on Bioblight, so he can turn up the pressure if he wants to, but there's no reason for him to take any unnecessary risks. I think he's going to take a controlling route in this game, and if it's convenient for him to go ahead and start attacking Reid's life total, ending the game that way, he will, but it's not a high priority.
Hero's Downfall will take care of Torrent Elemental. Joe wants to be able to make sure he can block next turn. Now, Reid does have a second copy of Whip of Erebos in the main deck. He wants to get that Torrent Elemental back into exile or falter through with attacking.
Murderous Cut's another path, but that's sort of a one-and-done path. Joe can answer with another removal spell and put Reid back in the same bind.
One main deck, one copy of Tassiger left in Reid's deck as well. So plenty of ways to exile it. He still has the Soul of Innistrad in his graveyard as well.
But keep in mind, End Hostilities is still in Joe's hand, so that shapes the entire game from Reid's perspective.
And for Reid, it's going to use one copy of Silumgar the Drifting Death. This is the Silumgar version from Fate Reforged. Some updates from the other side of the bracket. Michael Braverman, our 1 seed, may be facing his first loss in Standard, has dropped the first 2 games to Chris Anderson, who's playing Green-White Devotion.
Yeah, it's really Michael's first blemish in the Standard portion of this tournament.
Where the winner of that will go on to face the winner of this matchup. This matchup, though, such a slugfest between the 2 players.
And Silumgar is an interesting card here for Reid because Joe cannot kill this with conventional removal spells. So this may force the hand on End Hostilities.
Yeah, I was wondering whether or not you think Reid played that really to do just that, to force the End Hostilities out of Joe's hand.
I think what's likely to happen for a little while here is Reid's just going to chip away with Silumgar, probably add not much else to the table if he can avoid it. Joe's going to sit back with Tassiger, try to draw some cards, and get to a spot where he can end hostilities and then have gas in the tank to fight Reid's leftovers. So I think Joe's probably going to take a shot or 2 here. He doesn't want to pull the trigger on end hostilities just yet because he has some light to play with, but that's likely to be the answer to the Silumgar at some point down the road.
Yeah, Silumgar swings for 3, puts Joe down to 14. Now that seems so dangerous from Reid's side, though. If he's letting Joe get 2 to 3 Tassiger activations per turn, I mean, that's so many cards.
It is what it is, though. I'm not sure what other route Reid has. If he tries to be much more explosive than this, you know, doing something with the Soul of Innistrad, getting back a bunch of stuff, well, the End Hostilities still answers this. So it's not good for Reid's side to allow Joe to activate this Tassiger, but I don't know if there's anything else to be done about it.
All right, Reid is going to make a move on that Soul of Innistrad, wants to keep some pressure going. So he'll pay 5, it'll exile it. He gets 3 creatures back. We'll see what he picks. Looks like Tassiger, Courser of Krufix, and Courser of Krufix.
Because even if Reid gets back his own good individual threats like this Tassiger, Joe can answer that with the End Hostilities and still put Reid in the same holding pattern. So I think this is still going to end up being Silumgar versus End Hostilities.
Courser of Krufix played by Reid shows the top card of his deck. It is his second copy of Sidisi Undead Vizier. He'll play a land. You start thinking when going through Reid's deck, you're checklisting his different threats. He still has the Hornet Queen left. He still has a copy of Dragon Lord Silumgar left, and he has one copy each of Sidisi, Brood Tyrant, and Tasigur left as threats. Remember, both players actually have access to deck lists, not during a match, so Joe may not be able to keep a completely accurate list of what he has to get through.
And that's part of the reason that Joe is trying to avoid being super liberal. Oh, wow. We're getting close here.
Yeah, he milled 2 off Tasigur, he milled 2 lands, so his graveyard is now, he got a Hero's Downfall. I believe it's just lands and Ugin. We'll see if he can get it more lands. Draws Utter End for the turn.
But that's why Joe's not being very liberal with his removal spells here, because he knows eventually he's going to have to pull the trigger on the hostilities. At that point, he's going to have to beat Reid's leftovers.
Well, with copies of Hero's Downfall and Utter End in hand, he may be prepared to do just that.
You know, he's been sitting on Bile Blight for a very long time, and I'm sure the reason for that is so if Hornet Queen does show up, he's got a good answer.
Yeah, a lot of discipline on his side, knowing the deck list, knowing that Hornet Queen is one of Reid's trumps here. Reid does also have 1 remaining copy of Whip of Erebos that he needs to get through. As we mentioned, Utter End and Ugin are his only answers to Whip. The Ugin's already in his graveyard, so if he uses that Utter End on something else, he will be at the mercy of Whip of Erebos. Mills 2 there, Abzan Charm and Siege Rhino.
But this game is, at this stage, more of a game of chess and less of a game of Magic. Joe's working with very good information on the cards he needs to beat. He knows what Reid has gone through in terms of relevant cards, so at this point, Joe is just trying to leave the resources left in his hand to check off every box.
Yeah, Joe went for 1 main phase Tasigur activation. Had he hit 2 lands, Reid would have had to give him the Ugin, and he would be able to cast it there.
And Reid just can't let that happen.
That's why got a Siege Rhino instead, then decided to pass with 8 mana up. That is 2 more Tasigur activations if coming on Reid's end step. And with so many free cards off Tasigur, it's looking more and more likely that Joe will be able to get through all of Reid's threats.
It does seem that way. Now, Reid still has, you know, if he can find a copy of Thoughtseize, I don't know if all of them have been built over at this point. If he can get the end hostilities out of the hand, then maybe he can develop the board that way and force Joe's hand on using some of the spot removal, which opens up some of the outs. But
yeah,
right now things are tough.
It is worth noting Joe plays 2 main deck copies of End Hostilities. So his main deck sweepers are the Ugin and 2 End Hostilities. Ugin has already been used. 1 End Hostilities is in Joe's hand. But even if Reid Thoughtseizes one, he will have to dodge Joe drawing the second one. Over on the other side, Michael Braverman starting to mount a comeback. The player's going to game 4 in what figures to be a much quicker matchup.
Definitely, though Michael winning 2 games on the draw against Green White Devotion is going to be quite the challenge.
So we are back over to still on Reid's turn here. These players in game 1, Reid, Duke, and Joe Bass. This is the quarterfinals round of our Invitational here in Richmond. And second Courser of Kruphix from Reid. Trying to apply as much pressure as he can. He really wants to get that End Hostilities out of Joe's hand. Joe has gone down to 11 off Silumgar. Mills 2 again, it is Reid the Bones. So we look at the actual cards that we can choose between Reid the Bones, Abzan Charm, and Ugin.
Yeah, and Reid the Bones and Abzan Charm are very similar, except Abzan Charm is a bit more flexible and an instant. And again, Reid can't give him back the Ugin. So there you have it.
Joe, counting through his deck, wants to make sure, I would think, that his deck still has more cards than Reid's.
And I think that's why you're going to see Joe pull the trigger on this End Hostilities very soon. Part of it is his life total is taking some shots here, and Reid's added enough extra juice to the board to make the End Hostilities attractive. The other part of it is the incentive for Joe not to end hostilities at this point is that he has Tasigur and Reid does not. But if Joe's deck size starts to become a concern, the Tasigur loses a lot of value, and at that point, Joe might say, all right, let's clean up the board, I'll try to kill your leftovers, and either deck you, or maybe I can chain together enough Siege Rhinos and Elspeths to kill you.
Yeah, you see Joe declining to activate Tasigur a second time on Reid's turn.
Yep.
And here's a swing with both creatures. Yeah, that does feel like the End Hostilities you were mentioning.
Joe's gotten a lot out of this Tasigur, but now the deck size is an issue. He likely has a lot of removal spells at this point where he can win the battle over Reid's leftovers.
All right, Reid's going to throw everything in front of Tasigur. Let the Siege Rhino come through. Tasigur will kill one of the coursers. And Reid takes 4 down to 23. Tasigur off the board. This is the end hostilities that both players have known about.
Yeah. And this being in Joe's opening hand and Reid having a Thoughtseize has framed the whole game. And now, 15, 17 turns later, we're finally seeing it.
It's one of Joe's few ways to take care of Silumgar, the Drifting Death, but now that he's taking care of it, it's out of Reid. It's in Reid's graveyard. The Soul of Innistrad is already exiled. I don't know that Reid can permanently get back the 3/7. And now Joe will cast that Reid the Bones. So both players have been waiting for this end hostilities. We'll see what Reid's plan was when he gets to untap, see what threats he wants to make in the post-end hostilities board.
Well, he has a Tasigur to rebuild with, but we know at this point Joe can kill it, and Reid has a lot of anemic cards in his own graveyard that Joe can pretty freely give him back, and Reid's deck size is an issue. So Tasigur is definitely a powerful Magic card, but in this spot it's unclear how much value it can actually provide Reid.
All right, it's going to be Siege Rhino from Joe, puts himself back up to 14, and it'll be the second copy of Tasigur from Joe as well. Going to exile away most of his spells. We'll see what he actually keeps in the graveyard, if anything. Looks like once again it's going to be exiling everything but Ugin.
And now I think you're going to see Joe be very, very aggressive about adding threats to the table because he's no longer leaning on an end hostilities plan. Reid's down to very few cards in hand, and Joe might be able to push him out of the game pretty quickly.
All right, Satyr Wayfinder, the first play from Reid. Mills 4 cards, and there's the Hornet Queen.
And that's good news there for Joe because he still has the Bile-Blight in hand. So Whip of Erebos on the Hornet Queen is not very potent in this sequence.
For Reid, looking for 5, it's going to be Sidisi, Undead Vizier. Sacrificing Satyr Wayfinder, that tells us why he played it. The 4/6 Death Touch, a great blocker specifically against Siege Rhino and Tasigur.
Yep. Good size, and the text blocks here very powerful in the deck that Reid built. He's got a lot of trash left over and a lot of really powerful stuff to get out of his deck. So if Sidisi is going to be powerful, it's likely to be in a deck like this.
Remaining threats here, he still has 1 copy of Sidisi Brood Tyrant and 1 copy of Dragonlord Silumgar and 1 Tasigur and 1 Whip. So 4 cards left to get through. Murderous Cut being cast by Reid. He's going to delve away some Satyr Wayfinders and then that copy of Torrent Elemental again.
But keep in mind, this is not a Torrent Elemental loop because it doesn't involve Whip of Erebos. So Joe can go ahead. If he has a kill spell, which I'm sure he has plenty of at this point, that does it for Torrent Elemental.
For Joe, back on his turn, he'll scry Temple to the bottom. Hero's Downfall away Sidisi. Swing with Siege Rhino, Reid's down to 16. And now that the end hostilities has happened, Joe is just sitting on a handful of removal spells.
And Reid's life total diminishing. I would imagine still the first person to get decked in this game if it comes down to that. And just running out of gas. His Hornet Queen's gone. His Soul of Innistrad's gone.
Keep trying here. The one threat that keeps coming back is Torrent Elemental. For Reid, it's going to be, here's the last threat we were looking for. It's a copy of Dragonlord Silumgar. It will take the Siege Rhino. Then he'll cast the Torrent Elemental from exile and pass. And Utter End takes care of the Dragonlord Silumgar.
Yeah, this is not a very good matchup for Dragonlord Silumgar, even though there's some very juicy stuff for Reid to take on Joe's side, just because it's so easy for Joe to answer it.
What this does mean is because Joe used the Utter End on Dragonlord Silumgar, it means that if Reid finds his copy of Whip of Erebos, Joe will not have a way in his deck to remove it.
Yeah, but at this point, I think, Joe may be able to handle the last Whip if it shows up, just based on the removal spells that are left over in his hand.
Elspeth, Sun's Champion, played by Joe, plays 3 copies of this Planeswalker. It'll make 3 soldiers. We're back to Reid. Still gets to untap with Torrent Elemental. But now at 11, the life totals for the first time in a while favor Joe.
And the board position and cards at hand.
Yeah, despite all the synergy that Reid's deck has put together, Joe, by just playing very efficient threats and very efficient removal, has ground his way through nearly all of them.
I think Reid had a game plan that could have defeated the one end hostilities, but I think the Ugin was too much to overcome.
You felt like ever since that Ugin exiled the whip along with Reid's team, you did feel like Reid has been on the back foot.
Exactly. Reid was setting up a structure where, you know, he was going to probably be able to bleed out the end hostilities in a spot where he still had Whip of Erebos in play and Torrent Elemental going. So that would have been really good for him. But Ugin was too much to overcome.
Hero's Downfall takes care of the second Elspeth. Reid not attacking with Torrent Elemental, though knows that that's the wrong side of the race. He'll just hole up and see where he can go.
Yeah, 7 points coming across on Joe's side. Not a great attack to be made.
And Joe still with more Heroes Downfalls. He'll downfall the Torrent Elemental. Swing for 7. Reid is down to 4, and we may have reached the end of game 1. Reid will need to defend here, as it'll be his last copy of Tasigur. Exiling once again Torrent Elemental. And he's going to get rid of Thought Seizes. Doesn't want Joe giving him back a Thought Seize off Tasigur, so he exiles three Thought Seizes.
Not that this matters too much, because Reid's still got plenty of garbage in the graveyard, Caryatids and so forth, so I don't think Tasigur can be activated profitably at this point.
What I do like, if you even go back to that Murderous Cut where Reid started exiling all these Zeta Wayfinders, is he was doing that in anticipation of a Tasigur that he might play someday. Because while Sylvan Caryatid is a very low impact card, I think he can at least cast it, whereas casting the Zeta Wayfinders seems actively bad for him at this point.
Yeah, it's, you know, he's getting rid of his Fs before he's getting rid of his Ds, which is what you want to be doing. That's not a good sign for Reid if Joe's getting back the Hornet Queen.
Yeah, activates Tasigur. Joe gives him back Hornet Queen, yeah. Torrent Elemental is the play from Reid. I mean, it does seem like that play means that Reid is just dead, and he is. Murderous Cut takes down Tasigur. It's lethal on board, and game 1, after 37 minutes, goes to Joe Bass.
And one main deck Ugin is a trump card in the matchup here that Abzan Control and similar decks didn't have access to when Khans of Tarkir was the most recent set, and definitely changes this matchup. Once Joe picked it up, it gave him a very powerful path to play the game, and like I said before, it looked like Reid had a path to beat the end hostilities and the Elspeth, but the Ugin was too much to overcome.
Yeah, at the Players' Championship in December, this was the same format, but without Fate Reforged or Dragons of Tarkir. And at that time, Sultai Reanimator and these whip decks really were seen as a foil to traditional Abzan Control.
And I still think the matchup is fine for Reid, and we're going to be delving into the sideboard here in a moment, but the Ugin was a huge deal.
All right, game 1 is in the books. That one went to Joe Bass. If you're joining us, we have a full slate of Magic today for the Star City Games Invitational Top 8. And if you want to join us, join in on the conversation. That's going to be Twitch TV. We now have brought Twitch chat back to SCG Live with the Twitch subscription program. Everybody has slow mode chat available to them. However, we also have subscriber only mode. We have custom emoticons and a badge that you can have for $4.99 a month, featuring things such as your favorite commentators, a penguin wearing a jetpack, and our slow play turtle.
I like your favorite commentators because, well, of the three, this is someone's favorite commentator, second favorite commentator, and least favorite commentator. So you can use all the
it's your top 3.
Yeah.
All right.
Or your bottom 3, however you want to view it. It's all the same.
Learn more about it at twitch.tv/SCG Live. All right. So one thing I really always like about these black-green decks in Standard is that they have excellent sideboards. Now, both players playing black-green means that both of them can really customize their strategy for this matchup.
Right. Reid, you see 2 Doomweight Giants, 2 Bioblights, a Disdainful Stroke, 2 Heroes Downfalls, a Negate, 2 copies of Sultai Charm, a Pharika, God of Affliction, a Drown in Sorrow, a Duress, a Thoughtseize, and a Treasure Cruise. So there's some pretty generic, good stuff type of cards here for slow matchups. The Treasure Cruise, the Thoughtseize, the Duress, the Negate, and the Disdainful Stroke I think are all very powerful here. I think the additional Heroes Downfalls are good on Reid's side as well. And I think you may see the Pharika, God of Affliction coming in this matchup because it's a pretty slow grind. Reid's graveyard's going to end up filling up with a lot of garbage, as we saw there in game number 1. And Pharika's just a pretty potent card in games that get dragged out.
Yeah, Reid had no shortage of Sylvan Caryatids or Satyr Wayfinders that he could just maybe could want to exile with that Farika. And then he said Duress and Thoughtseize, Disdainful Stroke, they seem great against this ramp style strategy. Now, Hero's Downfall to me is an interesting one because Reid got to Downfall excellent targets. Every time Joe played, when Joe played something like an Elspeth or an Ugin, Reid was at the ready with a kill spell. Once it was Torrent Elemental, but for the other two, he immediately had the Hero's Downfall. But it seemed like the damage was already done once Joe had resolved the Walker.
It's true, but there are classes of cards, like Elspeth, for example, that Reid, if he answers immediately, don't really do very much, but in a dragged out game do matter. So I don't know if he necessarily wants to go up to the 4 copies of Hero's Downfall, but I could see perhaps adding 1, maybe going up to 4.
Yeah, Reid does have some good weapons here. On Joe's side, we see 3 Fleecemane Lions, an Erase, a Garruk Apex Predator, a Liliana Vess, 2 Sorin Solemn Visitor, 3 Drown in Sorrow, 2 Duress, and 2 Glare of Heresy. Now, there clearly are some things for different matchups. Drown in Sorrow and Glare of Heresy come to mind. The slow cards, Garruk, Liliana Vess, seem decent here. Now, how about things like Sorin or Fleecemane Lion? They were a little more borderline.
I don't like Fleecemane Lion because Reid's deck is so good at locking up the ground, and his deck is so powerful once it gets going that I don't think Fleecemane's appropriate for the matchup. I definitely like Garruk and Liliana. I even think Sorin's fine in this matchup. I think basically all the Planeswalkers are pretty powerful against Reid, given the other elements in Joe's deck. I think the 1 copy of Erase will certainly come in as an answer to Whip of Erebos, can also target Corsair or Crufix. I think that, you would think of Duress being good in control-style matchups, but Reid's deck doesn't really play that many spells. Now, post-board, Reid goes up quite a bit with the Treasure Cruise, the Thoughtseize, the Duress, the counter spells. So there's more of an incentive for Joe to bring in the Duresses, but I'm not positive he's going to.
Yeah, it's kind of in this cat and mouse game. As Reid sideboards more, it starts to change how Joe wants to sideboard.
Exactly. And there just really isn't that much crap in Joe's deck for game 1. Often these Abzan control decks, they have stuff for beatdown matchups and stuff for mid-range matchups. Since Reid is a control deck, but he's playing with a lot of creatures, almost all of Joe's cards are fine, and even some of the inefficient things like Bioblight, well, he may want to keep in a couple of those copies because of specific cards like Hornet Queen. So I think that Joe, he might sideboard on the light side, in part because most of his main deck's just pretty good here.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the spells he's chosen for the main deck, Abzan Charm, Bioblight, Hero's Downfall, Murderous Cut, Utter End Hostilities, Read the Bones, and Thoughtseize, there aren't too many of them that you would look at and say, hey, this is a loser in the matchup.
Yeah, it's really only Bioblight, and without Bioblight, Hornet Queen becomes a big issue. So Joe might, go down to 1 or 2 copies. I'd be stunned if he cut them all together.
All right, game 2 is underway. Reid Duke versus Joe Bass. Game 1 went to Joe, but both players have now adopted their sideboard configuration. That will be played for the remainder of the match. And it's going to be Reid this time, start with a turn 2 Satyr Wayfinder. Finally finds a land. He's been 0 for 2 up until this point on Satyr Wayfinders. Does mill some very high-end threats as well. Dragon Lord, Silumgar, and Hornet Queen, both now in the yard.
Hornet Queen being particularly good to get in the graveyard there.
Thoughtseize from Joe shows Torrent Elemental, Negate, Hero's Downfall, and 3 additional lands in Reid's hand. Not too many threats, wouldn't think.
Yeah, this is the type of hand from Reid that really needs something like Whip of Erebos, even the Treasure Cruise, a discard spell. But at this point, he's playing sort of a poor man's Sultai mid-range kind of game, and Joe's going to be able to gobble it up pretty easily. So Reid's going to need some good draw steps here.
Yeah, Joe Thoughtseizes away the Negate and plays a Temple, so he has left Reid with just the Downfall and the Torrent Elemental. Let's go over to Reid. Yeah, as it seemed last game, there was almost no pressure on Joe to ever win the game. He's really just in that control role of Joe needs to not lose.
Exactly.
So leaving Reid with cards like Hero's Downfalls seems fine. If Reid just has the all removal spell hand, you feel like Joe will get through that.
And Reid's really light on answers to Ugin or other big spells as they come up. So the Negate and the Disdainful Stroke are especially juicy targets for Thoughtseize and other discard spells.
Reid will play a 3rd land, swing for 1. Yeah, there is this bind where Reid does need to keep in cards that use cards like Negate, Disdainful Stroke, Hero's Downfall because Joe's threats. Though there aren't many of them, they're very high impact. At the same time, if Reid draws too many reactive cards, then this turns into a control mirror, which doesn't seem like where Reid wants to be either.
Yeah, Reid needs to sort of make the terms of engagement about something else, because if he's just running his cards directly into Joe's cards are probably going to win.
Corsair Crufix, the turn 3 play from Joe, shows Plains on top of the deck. This almost feels like a bait. He's playing it right into a hero's downfall he knows about, and Reid will oblige. He'll go ahead and downfall away the Courser.
Yeah, and it shows at risk of missing land drops, that Courser is really valuable, but if he's willing to expend it, this is just the type of trades he's looking to make. Just make Reid try to play the mid-range control game straight up with Joe.
Right. If he needed the lands, he would have played it a turn before. It really shows that he kind of was okay with that downfall, and we see now why turn 4 he does have a Siege Rhino.
Yep.
To be fair, Reid does have a blocker that we know about. He does have that 3/5 in hand. But even then, Reid is almost playing defense right now, which isn't really where he wants to be.
Well, there's a couple problems going on for Reid in the matchup. There's some matchups where, you can just beat people just straight up with your stuff just by casting your threat cards. That's not going to happen in this matchup very often. Joe can handle that sort of thing. And then there's the types of matchups where you can try to just go through your graveyard and overpower people, other mid-range matchups typically. The graveyard is a little bit harder for Reid to use post-board because Joe has more answers to Whip of Erebos. And we also saw at game 1 that Joe was just able to overpower an uncontested Whip of Erebos with things like Ugin.
And Joe's playing his value cards, was able to get through the contraptions that Reid was trying to set up. So for Reid, he does have land 5. It's Polluted Delta. We know he has Torrent Elemental. He has drawn some cards since then. And on 5, it is going to be Sidisi Undead Vizier, so that has been added to his hand. And this really lets Reid sculpt his game plan going forward.
I'm curious to see if Reid's going with Whip of Erebos here, or if he's pursuing a different path. Looks like he's going to get Treasure Cruise. So just trying to play the value game a little bit as well.
Well, yeah, what I like about that play is that Joe doesn't have foils to Treasure Cruise. He does have an Erase hiding in his hand. And Reid, there's a calculation. If you play Whip of Erebos and you want to not get blown up by something like Erase, you'd have to wait until land number 8 to do so. Yeah. Whereas Joe, not a blue deck's not really going to counter Treasure Cruise. It's good for 3 cards in most situations.
It's just a big long ball too, Reid can get Treasure Cruise, Whip of Erebos, let's say, go get his Hornet Queen back, and Joe has a Bioblight, and it's like nothing really happened. The Treasure Cruise is guaranteed to do something. And there's a good chance the Treasure Cruise just finds Whip of Erebos anyway.
Well, an interesting development here. On Joe's turn, he did not have land 5, so he actually adopted a more aggressive play here. Heroes downfalled away the Sidisi, hit in for 4, put Reid down to 12. But with only 4 lands in play, Reid may be able to capitalize on this situation.
Definitely. I mean, Reid's got to be pretty happy with this spot. And I like playing the Torrent Elemental here because this probably requires some response from Joe. Reid can just block the Siege Rhino, and Joe's taking a pretty aggressive posture here, so you assume that could happen. And if the Torrent Elemental goes to the graveyard exchanging for one of Joe's cards, well, that's something to get dealt away by the Treasure Cruise.
And that's exactly what I like about this play. You see Joe swinging in with Siege Rhino, is that Reid could have played Torrent Elemental and delved for Treasure Cruise in the same turn, but he's holding off on the Treasure Cruise so that if the Torrent Elemental dies, he can rebuy it. He's really max valuing.
Yeah.
You see Siege Rhino swing, blocked by Torrent Elemental. Reid is going to fetch here. We'll see whether Joe actually finishes off the Torrent Elemental or whether it was just a bluff. No reason to hold back the Siege Rhino on defense. It's not like it can block Torrent Elemental anyway.
If you ain't blocking, you're attacking.
Yeah, it was just that. But Joe did hit land 5, and it was a temple. So maybe we'll get to continue to build up toward his late game spells. I believe he has his one-of copy of Ugin in hand. We did see last game, once Joe had survived to turn 8 and made Ugin, things got very difficult for Reid.
Now, Reid can be pretty cavalier with his Treasure Cruise because Joe can't counter it, but I don't think he wants to wait all day because he is playing against a deck with Thoughtseize. Joe may have brought in the Duresses as well, and so I don't think he wants to wait for the absolute perfect time to cast this Treasure Cruise. There's some incentive just to fire it off when there's a good window.
And that's what he's going to do right now. And we have seen that if he waits too long, if he waits until Joe starts making cards like Ugin, extra cards on Reid's side almost stop mattering.
There is some help here that Reid gets access to more discard spells post-board and some counter spells, so he may be able to win the fight over Ugin, but as you mentioned, he kind of needs to be proactive about this stuff.
All right, Treasure Cruise taps 3, delves 5, leaves himself with only, and if you look very careful about the cards that Reid left, he left only large creatures in the graveyard, delving away his lands as well. Left Hornet Queen, Courser, Dragonlord Silumgar, and Sidisi. So it's always great to see this setup. He's trying to set up a perfect graveyard for Whip of Erebos, while at the same time wanting to make one that is Tasigur friendly.
Yes. Fortunately, those are often going to be the same thing.
Yeah, well, there's slight differences. If it was just a Whip of Erebos graveyard, he probably would have kept Satyr Wayfinder in it because that's a fine card to whip sometimes. However, that is bad if you play a Tasigur, so he does get to play both sides.
Yep.
While it's still in combat, Torrent Elemental swings. It'll tap Siege Rhino. See whether it gets to connect for damage. Actually, we're going to go, sorry, Siege Rhino attacking over on Joe's turn. Murderous Cut will take care of Siege Rhino. And then Liliana Vess, the follow-up for Joe, does have to tap out for it.
But this is a pretty safe spot. Reid's not going to add a lot of haste unless he goes Whip and get something back in the same turn.
Yeah. +1 to get Reid to discard a card. And one thing we've noticed with Reid, because he has all these card advantage engines out of the graveyard, making him discard one from hand, it usually seems like he's had extra cards lying around.
Yeah, he's got some resources to work with, but Liliana can't stay and play uncontested because the tutoring power is very good here for Joe in certain spots. Because at that point, you know, he goes and gets Ugin. At that point, it's protected from a discard spell. So you're looking at just the Disdainful Stroke as being able to answer it. And the ultimate is going to be game over against a deck like Reid's a good percentage of the time.
Absolutely. And now Reid will fire Duress. And we see there is Ugin, the Spirit Dragon. Ugin, Erase, and End Hostilities. Last game, that End Hostilities and Ugin combo was the 1-2 punch that knocked out Reid. Well, he'll get to take one of the two.
Well, this is pretty good news for Reid because the Ugin, if he wants to take it, is just gone for good unless some Tasigur shenanigans occur.
Because it's in Joe's hand, it means Joe can't tutor for it.
Exactly. If Reid feels like he can close out the game pretty quickly here, he may take End Hostilities. It's a big risk, especially because Joe can simply untap, tutor with Liliana, probably find some answer to be able to bridge the gap to Ugin.
And that is a risk he's not willing to take. He'll go ahead and make Joe discard the Ugin. Leaves Joe with a sweeper, but right now with a board of Torrent Elemental, End Hostilities is something that Reid can maybe manage.
This is not a bad spot for Reid. The Liliana is a medium-term concern here, and Reid may try to take it out over the course of a couple turns here.
Yeah. What Erase, knowing about the Erase in Joe's hand means also that if Reid gets Whip of Erebos, he will almost certainly see him wait until he gets that 8th land before deploying it.
Yeah, it's going to be a one and done on Whip of Erebos.
Draw for Joe. He'll plus Liliana to 4. Does not want to lose it just yet. And Temple on Joe's side, so that's land number 7. Before we were building up toward land 8, although at this point, 7 should be enough to cast just about any of his threats. He has that the Garruk Apex Predator out of the sideboard, which I would assume is in now, so land 7 is helpful for him. Liliana down to 1 off Torrent Elemental. Reid with no other plays, he'll just pass.
Well, I don't think Reid's looking to make any other plays because Joe might determine on his own that it's worth using the End Hostilities just to protect the Liliana for a couple more turns. And if Joe doesn't make that determination, well, he's either using kill spells on your Torrent Elemental or the Torrent Elemental gets to finish off the Liliana. So there's no big rush here for Reid to add to his board, even if he could.
Well, Joe with a pretty good draw of his own. There's a copy of Tasigur the Golden Fang. That wasn't there previously. But he'll get to play that exiling once again, everything but Ugin.
And this is that pressure spot we saw. It didn't exactly come up in game number 1, but now Reid's got to cross his fingers that it's not 2 lands that get flipped over. But the other problem is almost all of Joe's spells are very potent in this spot.
Well, if you look at the game that happened here, so Joe had the option between casting End Hostilities, getting rid of Torrent Elemental, and plussing the Liliana and just continuing to protect the Liliana, but he decided that End Hostilities is too valuable of a weapon to use in that way. So by playing Tasigur here, he is forfeiting his Liliana most likely.
Yeah.
But Liliana has gotten 3 discards out of Reid. Now, were they all lands? Yes, but it does mean that Reid has not been able to have that land 8 that he may have wanted for a Whip of Erebos.
It's also absorbed quite a bit of damage in a spot where Joe had nothing going on.
Yeah, Joe still had a very healthy 15 life points. And with that, we are back over to Reid. Untaps will get the option to take out Liliana Vess, and that'll be the play. Tasigur taps, Liliana is down. Soaks up 9 damage and 3 cards from Reid.
Interesting to see Joe not respond there with an activation of Tasigur. I think that Liliana is a much less potent card in this spot than Ugin.
Well, if you're going to set up the graveyard of just Ugin, I mean, there's a thought of, hey, I like all these cards, but I think the way you want to think about it is you want the best one. You don't want the second best one. So, yeah, I agree.
Because there's no way that the Liliana comes back unless Joe finds an even inferior spell, in which case he wouldn't have gotten the Ugin anyway.
Right.
But I think he just...
By putting Liliana in the graveyard, this means Ugin is not coming back.
Right.
Maybe Liliana is, but Ugin certainly isn't.
So now you see a little tick for tat here from Reid as he plays his own Tasigur. Once Joe commits his Tasigur to the table, it makes it more attractive for Reid to build up his board a little bit because the end hostilities blunts the Tasigur on Joe's side of the table as well.
So Reid immediately plays his Tasigur and activates it, milling 2. Joe gave Reid back Courser of Krufix. And here's Joe's own Tasigur activation, shows Thoughtseize and Llanowar Wastes. Very possible that Joe was getting the Thoughtseize regardless. We'll see whether he gives him that or Liliana. And yeah, it's going to be Liliana. So that sequencing you talked about really came back here.
Yep. The only thing that it could do is give the option of Reid to give him a Liliana. Now, if you wanted to hold up his mana for something, maybe, that opportunity cost is high enough where he would rather have the flexibility, but...
Yeah, it does depend what he has in hand.
Yeah. But on the board, it did not look good.
Well, and that will put Joe into end hostilities. So cast end hostilities here, maybe setting up now for end hostilities and then redeploying Liliana. Plays a temple.
But you gotta feel uncomfortable in your Joe spot here because Reid's working with information. He knew you had end hostilities. And instead of giving you a Thoughtseize, he gave you an objectively more powerful Liliana. That means whatever Reid feels like he's got on the follow-up is really, really powerful.
Yeah, the only reason we're in this situation of end hostilities into Liliana is because Reid said it was okay to go here.
Yeah, and he had some outs. He did not have to give Joe the option of doing this.
Yeah, well, he denied Joe the opportunity to have Thoughtseize, which means whatever card's hiding in Reid's hand, Reid deems it as very important here.
Right.
And we might just see what it is. Courser of Krufix is the play from Reid. He gets a polluted Delta off the top of his deck and actually just passes the turn. So the draw from Joe. He does have that Liliana to rebuild with that we know about.
But now with Reid with Downfall on top of the deck, Liliana's still okay here. He's going to get a card or a tutor, but...
Yeah, and that's assuming that Reid doesn't have something like Disdainful Stroke in his hand.
I think that unless Reid's hand is insane, I think he's unlikely to do anything about this Liliana.
Yeah, whatever Liliana tutors, even if it's Disdainful Stroke, whatever Liliana tutors for, Reid can probably cast Disdainful Stroke on.
Exactly. Joe's not tutoring for Reid the Bones here, most likely, so.
Here's Liliana Vess. She will resolve. She's at 5. Will Joe go back to the strategy of plussing it and making Reid kill it, or will he tutor? It looks like this time it's a tutor. And it may just be because Liliana is still safe from attacks.
Yep.
On our other match, we have our first player into the top 4. That is Chris Anderson. Michael Braverman, despite going 8-0 throughout the tournament's Swiss rounds, he has finally been defeated in standard 3-1 by Chris Anderson's green-white devotion deck. Congratulations then to Mike on a very impressive tournament, and congratulations to Chris on his top 4 finish.
I'm sure that deck is, or some version of it, is going to be in a lot of teams' gauntlets for the Pro Tour coming up in 2 weeks. An 8-0 performance in the Invitational, very impressive, but Chris Anderson able to get it done with that green-white devotion deck. That's the type of matchup where it gets determined very quickly. One of those decks is typically running the other right out of the game.
And a draw of Hero's Downfall from Reid. So the Disdainful Stroke not in his hand, but it is on top of Reid's deck. Courser of Krufix will put Liliana down to 1.
And this is an interesting little game here as well because Reid knows about the erase, but Reid, casting Courser, putting into play. Joe doesn't really want to use the erase right now because it's his insurance plan against Whip of Erebos. But in the meantime, Reid might be able to do a lot of damage with his Courser of Krufix.
It turns out Reid because he didn't have a loser to discard to the Liliana, he's going to go ahead and Hero's Downfall Liliana.
Yep.
If he had a land, you may have seen him let Joe untap with Liliana. But for Joe, now here's the real prize Planeswalker. It's going to be Elspeth Sun's champion. She goes up to 5 and makes 3 soldiers. Does Reid have another Hero's Downfall? We will see. And so far, it looks like he does not. Disdainful Stroke will be the draw from Reid. Thoughtseize awaits on the top of the deck. Thoughtseize not, because of that erase interaction you're talking about, Thoughtseize may be a draw that Reid actually wants. At the same time, he's lower on life than
I think Reid needs to find stuff to do. You know, I think his hand at this point is downfall plus disdainful stroke. So he's got the board covered and he's got a big draw covered. And if he finds something very powerful of his own, that could really be enough to amount to a game win.
I like just the tactical play here from Reid. Rather than end stepping that second hero's downfall, recognize that he has an excess of mana. He'll go ahead and draw for the turn to get extra information, and then see if he still wants. Maybe he has another way to deal with Elspeth and can save the hero's downfall.
Exactly, it's very sharp. He knows because he's drawing Disdainful Stroke that mana is not going to be a bottleneck for him, so he has the liberty of making that play.
Yeah, he'll pass, and during upkeep, he will hero's downfall the Elspeth.
And that's the power of downfall in the matchup. That's another card like the Liliana, like the Garruk, that if Reid kills right away, the one activation is unlikely to doom him.
Yep, so 3 soldiers facing off against Reid's 2-4. Both players really playing top deck wars at this point. Reid with a Courser, though, you have to like where he's at in that position. Courser and Disdainful Stroke, I think, give Reid the edge here.
Yeah, I mean, both of these decks have huge draws, and the game can get turned in one player's favor very quickly. Reid with Sidisi on top of his deck, that's a really big play next turn, potentially. But I like Reid's spot right now. I believe he's a little bit ahead.
Well, it'll take Joe, he'll outdraw Joe over the course of time, thanks to Courser of Kruphix, until Joe kills it. And if Joe hits one Haymaker, Reid is not going to be, he will be able to counter the first one.
Now, this is where a lot of Joe's power comes from in the matchup, is the Read the Bones and the Obzone charms. In spots like this where Reid has a very good answer to one thing, just drawing 2 cards over and over again gives Joe the opportunity to find multiple powerful things to do and overwhelm Reid's defenses. Keep in mind, Reid's cast a lot of downfalls, the negate's gone. If Joe can bleed out the Disdainful Stroke, Reid does not have a lot of catch up to Joe's proactive plays.
Joe resolving Read the Bones. Believe he has another copy of picked up a second copy of Elspeth. But he knows about the Disdainful Stroke. He'll go ahead and cast Elspeth into it. And you can see his posture just waiting there for Reid to counter it.
Yep. Although this is not auspicious here for Reid if that's the test spell for the Disdainful Stroke.
I mean, I think if you're on Joe's side, the only reason you would hang on to that Elspeth is if you're hoping to draw into a Thoughtseize or a Duress before going for Elspeth.
It means that he has a follow-up play ready to go.
Swing from Courser of Kruphix at Joe. From Reid, no good blocks there, so Joe will take 2. He goes to 11. And for Reid, it's going to be Sidisi Brood Tyrant. Milling 3 cards, hits a Thoughtseize, Hero's Downfall, and a Courser. It'll make a zombie. Shows another copy of Sidisi on top. Which actually, there's some value here because Joe would have been able to trade his soldiers for Sidisi, but less inclined to do so now that he knows there's a backup one. And now we see what the test spell was about. Joe having another Planeswalker in his hand. This one is Garruk Apex Predator. And
this is really bad news for Reid because the game is shaping up right now where Joe may just be able to go, make a beast, make a beast, make a beast, ultimate. It's going to be hard for Reid to power through this, and just with the soldier tokens alone, that ultimate power is going to be really hard to beat. And the 3/3 Death Toucher every turn is likely to check a lot of what Reid can do.
And over on Reid's side, Sidisi will attack, mills his copy of Farika, makes another zombie. And Joe will trade the beast token away with Sidisi. And here is another copy of Sidisi for Reid.
And Soul of Innistrad, a huge card to reveal.
Yeah, mills Soul of Innistrad and Sidisi, Undead Vizier. Reid plays a land off the top, then shows a temple. Doing what he can to power through this Garruk, but you see him definitely realizing that this is something he needs to answer before it gets too big.
Soul of Innistrad is huge here because getting back Sidisi, if he wants to, allows him to tutor for downfall, and Reid's board is overwhelming besides that.
Yeah, if Garruk gets off that is no longer on this board, it is a certain advantage for Reid.
Yep.
So here's the second end hostilities from Joe Bass. He'll clear the board. There is enough mana on Reid's side to use that soul. But will it be enough? Joe will have some creatures left to protect the Garruk. And you see Garruk up to 7 makes a beast token. And Reid will activate Soul. What are the 3 he wants to get back? does actually, if Joe pluses the Planeswalker too much, Reid has a copy of Dragonlord Silumgar in his graveyard. He can steal the Garruk and ultimate it for Joe.
I felt like, I don't exactly know what's in Joe's hand right now, but it felt like that and hostilities might have been rushed by maybe one turn, because it feels like Reid has to add a little bit more to his board to get through the Garruk, and at that point the end hostilities becomes a lot more potent. As it stands, you sweep the board. Reid gets back a lot of action here. Hornet Queen,
Farika, and Dragonlord Silumgar.
I mean, that's a huge board to rebuild with.
Right, and this paralyzes the Garruk, right? Joe can't plus this.
Yep.
Reid will steal it and kill it. So yeah, there's a 3/3 beast in play, and that's problematic, but Reid has more than enough ammunition to get through it.
Right, now Joe probably has to go into this sort of plussing and minusing my Garruk sort of plan. If he minuses too low, well then Reid can also take it and steal it. So it puts some real handcuffs on how Joe can use his Planeswalker here.
This is interesting. It's one of the things about this new Dragonlord Silumgar, its ability to pressure opposing Planeswalkers, even in a matchup where your opponent really is overloaded on removal.
Yep.
Now, because of how its ability works, if Joe has a card like Hero's Downfall and Reid plays Dragonlord Silumgar, and with the trigger on, Joe kills Dragonlord Silumgar, Reid will never actually get control of the Planeswalker. So Joe can save his Garruk that way.
Correct.
Here's Farika, Joe with the erase. Will Reid make some snakes in response?
I believe so.
As many as he can. He'll go for 4 of them.
And this is another moment of just slowly bleeding Joe out of resources. You can see post-board, Reid does become a little bit better at playing the beat you straight up kind of game. I think that Joe is still favored in those kind of games, but he does have cards like Farika, Treasure Cruise, the counterspells that allow him to sort of play mid-range against mid-range.
Yep. Yeah, Reid down to 12. No Urborg actually yet in play on either side, so Reid did have to pain twice to make 4 snakes. The activation is black-green, not too colorless, but 4 Death Touch snakes in play nonetheless. We'll see a Thought Seize from Joe. Well-timed here. This will free up the Garruk. Yeah, you see taking Dragonlord Silumgar.
Yep. I mean, Whip of Erebos is still a draw of concern for Joe if he puts Garruk up to 8, but he's looking at kind of fading the one draw.
Yeah, so it's at 8, so that's what he's going to have to get around now. Reid's other card is Hornet Queen. In the situation that Reid cannot kill it this turn, he can certainly lower it if he wants to swing his snakes into the Garruk. Reid now checking Joe's graveyard.
Well, it's not just an issue of the snakes at this point, it's also the ultimate. Now, Reid gets some blockers here with the Hornet Queen, but...
Yeah, the ultimate giving Reid an emblem that means when players attack Reid, their creatures get very large.
And the Death Touch trample interaction means those beasts are a lot of damage. The other issue here is if Reid's on this play enough, I'm going to whittle down your Garruk. Joe can say, okay, no blocks, raise you back with my 3/3s, crank out a 3/3 every turn. And if Joe has some sort of removal spell for the Hornets, then he can win the race that way as well.
Well, here come the creatures in. The snakes going at Garruk Apex Predator. Reid not going to give Joe the option of keeping the emblem, and Joe may just go the strategy you talked about. Garruk will take all 4 points of damage.
It's not like Reid even has follow-up for lethal on the Garruk next turn unless he's committing more stuff to the table. So no reason to be trading there. Reid's at 12, and these 3/3 Death Touchers are a big long-term problem.
You want to talk about Death Touchers? Now here's Hornet Queen. She'll bring 4 more Death Touchers. And Silumgar the Drifting Death. Reid is all in here, knowing that both of Joe's copies of End Hostilities have already been cast. Ugin is gone. I don't believe Joe has a sweeper left, unless he's boarded in a Drown in Sorrow, which if he has would be a huge play here.
Yeah.
Garruk up to 5 makes a beast. That would be quite the play if that happens.
And what's nice about this is Reid is also really protected from the minus effect right now. All of his creatures are either hexproof or super expendable, so Joe does not have a juicy target to kill with Garruk.
You see no Bile-Blight, no Drown in Sorrow. Joe just makes a beast and passes back. And Reid 10 attackers.
And now I'm curious, how many copies of Bile-Blight did Joe leave in his deck? Because there's spots like this where it's really powerful. In many of the games, it's not going to be very effective at all. So it's, high variance kind of card. This would be a great spot for it. But I'm not even sure Joe has any in his deck at this point. Uh-oh.
On Reid's side, what is the play here?
Uh-oh.
This is Whip of Erebos. That is and Joe not even just concedes to that one.
Not bad. I think if Joe was on empty there, which I suspect he was, Reid's board was going to be good enough to get the job done.
On that turn, or was it just too much value?
A turn or two later. But with Whip of Erebos, it's no contest. That's too much.
At that point, Joe can't race. He can't remove it. Reid had forced a situation where Joe had to use the erase on Farika, which meant that the coast was clear for Whip of Erebos.
Yep.
So Reid evens up the series at 1 game apiece. Joe Bass and Reid Duke. Remember, this is a best-of-5 series, so at least 2 more games to come. The winner will face off against, now we know, Chris Anderson in the top 4.
You can see Cedric Phillips here bright and early.
So the sideboard games there, the matchup does seem to change a bit on Reid's side. Joe resolved both End Hostilities and the Ugin. Now, before that 1-2 punch was good enough with just 1 End Hostilities and Ugin to get through Reid's deck. But that game, it felt like it still wasn't enough.
Well, Reid is able to tilt his deck a little bit post-board into being able to play kind of a straight-up game without removing too much of the integrity of his graveyard plan. So I'm sure he's getting away from some of his moving parts a little bit. He's a little bit lower emphasized on the graveyard stuff. He can still do stuff with Whip of Erebos and so forth. But for example, something like Sylvan Carry Added, that might be out of the deck because he's no longer just trying to race for a fast thing out of his graveyard or for anything in general.
If he plays a turn 3 Sidisi, it still dies to Hero's Downfall.
Exactly. There's no rush. And Reid's post-board plan slows his deck down quite a bit. He is playing a little more of Joe's game, but he does get a lot more effective at fighting that kind of battle.
Yeah, and on Joe's side, it's mainly his game 1 deck. He can switch up his answers a little bit, and we saw that Garrick Apex Predator and Liliana Vest both in, but not even certain he boarded in copies of Duress. He hadn't played one that game.
And I don't know if the Sorens came in also, which is a card that I'm kind of on the fence about.
All right, for those of you just joining us, we are right now in the quarterfinals of our Invitational here in Richmond. This is going to be standard for the top 8. We're going to work our way through the bracket. So you see there, the 1 versus 8 matchup, Chris Anderson, the first player to defeat Michael Braverman in standard, and he did it at just the right time. The top 8 match between the two. Michael was able to get game 3, but in 4, Chris Anderson is victorious. He is in their semifinals, awaiting the winner of Reid Duke and Joe Bass. Now, at the conclusion of this match, we will bring you the other half of the bracket, which is going to be Todd Anderson and Jason Coleman. Todd 8-0ing day 2 to make it in, our only Jeskai player. He'll be against Obs on aggro. And then this is the matchup I'm looking forward to. Ross Miriam, green-red aggro. This has been a really dragon-full deck that people brought. A lot of new cards, and he'll be facing off against a tough challenge in Jacob Wilson.
Yeah, that one's going to be real good.
Remember, those will not start, though, until the conclusion of this match between Reid Duke and Joe Bass. They move on to game 3. Joe will get to be on the play for the first time here. Now, one thing we noticed there, what Joe lost to was really, he got swarmed at the end there. We saw he had a lot of 3/3 Death Pressures, but Reid, 4 Snake Tokens, 4 Hornets. Mentioning on a board set like that if Joe had a card like Drown in Sorrow, would have been fantastic for him. Now, he does have some options like Drown in Sorrow and Bile-Blight that, while not traditionally good against Reid's deck, can get him out, can be great answers in very specific situations. Can Joe afford to play cards like that?
To an extent, I think the fact that Reid has his own discard spells means he's vulnerable in the other direction, where Reid opens on a discard spell. Joe has some fidgety situational cards. Reid takes his one substantial card and leaves Joe with a hand that doesn't do very much.
He takes the Siege Rhinos and leaves them with Drown in Sorrow.
Exactly. So I think that Joe needs to have a little bit of an insurance policy against those sort of scenarios. I think that I wouldn't cut Bile-Blight entirely out of the deck, for example, maybe go down to 1 copy, but he needs to have some degree of protection against some of those situations that we saw occur in game number 2.
You can tell with both players, not much time spent sideboarding. They have practiced this matchup and know what they want to be doing as we start game 3.
And this is not a matchup that's play-draw biased because it's so slow. So the cards you like are the cards you like.
I mean, is it so not play draw biased? Is there an argument to taking the draw, just having more cards?
I think so. I think there is an argument for that. It's so unorthodox that I think a lot of players don't even consider it.
Neither player has chosen it. Both have had the choice.
Reid elected to play in game 2, and Reid's the type of player where if that was on his radar, he
it
would
is on his
definitely do
radar,
it.
yeah. And we'll see duress from Reid. All right, get a look at Joe's starting hand. Started with 3 lands, and this is a great hand for the matchup. 3 lands, Thoughtseize, Downfall, Read the Bones, Obzon Charm. This is just how Joe drew it up.
Exactly. He doesn't want any of his critical pieces in his opening hands, especially his one-ups like Ugin. We saw what happened that last game when he just drew it and Reid was able to take it with a discard spell. So this hand is about perfect for Joe. It's just card drawing. It's resistant. It's got answers. There's no hole to poke with it with this discard spell. This is pretty close to the 7 that Joe would ask for.
I mean, he basically kept a 9-card hand on the play.
Yep.
Reid will take 2 of those. He'll get rid of that Read the Bones. And for Joe, now there's the Thoughtseize you know about. We'll see Reid's side of the board. And Reid, wow, kept a hand of 4 lands, Thoughtseize, Sylvan Caryatid, and Torrent Elemental. Looks like he drew a land on his first turn as well.
I mean, I think this hand's keepable, again, because the games are so slow. But this is towards the bottom end of keepable hands.
I'm surprised to see the Sylvan Caryatid in post board.
Same. I thought that card would have been perhaps one of the first ones to be cut. There could be some situational one-ups he doesn't want, but...
Well, you see how little respect Joe pays to it. So he had Thoughtseize there. He took Reid's Torrent Elemental. I mean, Sylvan Caryatid at its best on turn 2. Joe doesn't seem to care about Reid ramping on mana.
And Torrent Elemental in the graveyard is not necessarily very good for Joe either, but as you mentioned, it does indicate Joe has no respect for that card.
And Reid's draw, he'll Thoughtseize back. Not too bad. Joe's pickup from the last turn was a copy of Tasigur. Reid may be priced into taking that. If he takes something else, Joe gets to make Tasigur on turn 3, and Reid does not have an answer for it.
Exactly. It's 3 cards in the graveyard and a 3rd mana, so I'm sure Reid would have liked to take an Obzon Charm out of a weak hand here and just give himself time to draw some action, but he's just got to take Tasigur now. Joe's going to be able to draw 2 cards.
And for Joe, here's that Urborg, leaving up Obzon Charm mana. He'll pass. See if Reid plays anything worth killing. And Reid not paying too much respect for Sylvan Caryatid either, as he doesn't have a threat in hand, just went for that Thoughtseize on turn 2. He'll delay the Caryatid a turn.
Well, he would have also been thrilled to just get the Obzon Charm out of Joe's hand last turn. If Joe drew a land or something not much of consequence, then Joe's hand at that point is just a downfall, and Reid has a lot of time to draw out of it.
Joe Obzon Charms on end step, draws 2 extra cards. The 2 cards he found also very good here. Garruk Apex Predator and a 2nd Obzon Charm.
Yeah, the 2nd Obzon Charm, a great draw here. I'm sure Joe is fine with the Garruk, but again, he does not want his high-impact one-ups to be stranded in his hand, because Reid can draw a discard spell, and those one-ups are really important to his game plan, especially Ugin.
Reid playing a 5th land and passing, and Joe, this is how he drew it up. Resolves a 2nd Obzon Charm. Both players trading land drops. Joe drawing extra cards. This looks good for him. Land 5 for Joe Bass. Any threats yet? Here will be a 2nd copy of Tasigur. And I love this, how he's gotten to play the Tasigur with 4 mana open. He did have to delve away his entire graveyard for it, which means there's a chance this Tasigur misses, but as we saw in game 1, Joe really ran away with that game when he just played Tasigur and activated it 4 times.
Well, Reid's got nothing going on right now. Joe's got some removal spells in his hand. Reid, we don't even know if he has the capacity to kill the Tasigur, and so just a 4/5 that draws a card every turn is really good for Joe. This Tasigur doesn't have to win the game for this to be very profitable for Joe, and there's a chance this Tasigur just does win the game on its own.
I mean, if you're in Joe's spot and Reid doesn't kill your Tasigur, I almost feel like do you do anything but activate it until Reid kills it? I mean, this is a board style, sounds great. Do you see Whip of Erebos, Reid? This is concerning for Joe because of the interaction between Torrent Elemental and Whip. And for Joe, it is a miss. He, on end step, went for the milled 2 lands, so no free card off the 4/5.
Yeah, Whip and Torrent Elemental, very powerful interaction. It does mean from a damage race perspective that Reid's got a lot of time to work with because he's going to be getting some life here along the way. Unfortunately, it's not a long-term answer to the Tasigur, and if that's left unchecked, you have to imagine at some point Joe finds the answer to the Whip of Erebos, and all of Reid's work is undone.
I mean, Reid can even simply kill spell his. I was gonna say Joe could kill spell his way through Torrent Elemental with Tasigur. Now, Hornet Queen, on the other hand, is a much bigger problem for Joe.
Yeah, and now we're going to get to see, has Joe left any answers to Hornet Queen besides his big sweepers?
Well, here's Obzon Charm number 3. He'll go ahead. I was like, I don't think he exiled his own Tasigur.
Yeah.
No, he drew 2 cards off. It went down to 12.
The oft overlooked 4th mode of kill your own creature. Little late in the tournament to be seeing that.
Corsair Krufix is the play for Joe. And remember, because of that Torrent Elemental in the graveyard, Joe's not going to be able to block. Not to mention everything's already in the air.
Yeah.
This is a 2-turn clock Reid is presenting. Joe needs an answer fast. He'll crack a fetch line. Doesn't want to see Corsair on top. And while Joe had a great late game setup, one way that Reid can counter that is simply by going aggressive. Hornet Queen plus Whip may just be enough.
Yeah, and as the first 2 games were such slogfests, and it looked like this game was also shaping up to be the same way, but Joe might just get punked out of this game by having no answer to Whip of Erebos or Hornet Queen, and it could be over that fast.
It feels like the second game in a row where an uncontested Hornet Queen may just do Joe in. Shuffles Temple on top of his deck. He will play a land from hand. He wants the mana for Tasigur.
Yes.
All right. So
I mean, that feels like a pretty soft turn if you already had land number 7 and your plan is just to activate Tasigur. But if Joe's setting up for a sweeper next turn, maybe he's just trying to bleed out one more card.
Well, it makes sense to get the land there as opposed to playing the Temple. If the card under the Temple is a sweeper, he will get it off Tasigur.
Oh, no, I just Joe's turn there is a little head scratchy. Maybe he has nothing going on, but...
Yeah, I mean, it certainly feels like a weak hand from Joe.
And the problem is that Joe can't really induce anything more out of Reid at this stage because, well, Reid has a very easy out to not play anything else, which is just get back Torrent Elemental with Whip of Erebos.
You see for Reid, whipping back Torrent Elemental, swinging, and just the heads-up play is going to leave back 1 Hornet as a blocker, just in case Joe can try to counter race. Wants to make sure that he does not take any additional damage. That said, though, he'll gain a ton of life. It's 8 points gained on Reid's side. He's up to 21. Joe down to 5.
And Reid is still presenting well past lethal next turn.
And Utter End was one of the 2 cards milled off Tasigur. A turn earlier would have been great as it takes care of Whip of Erebos, but it doesn't take care of a swarm of insects.
I would have to guess this is going to be Obzon Charm here. Because even End Hostilities is not an out in this spot, as Reid can simply whip back the Torrent Elemental.
Yeah, Obzon Charm is what's gotten back.
At this point, he's demanding multiple answers from Joe. Obzon Charm doesn't answer anything on the board. And can Joe really cobble together 2 answers, spending 3 mana drawing 2 cards?
Well, if Joe had something like Bioblight, he could play Liliana, go find a card he needed. If he has 1 card to find, he could draw Liliana, find the card he needs, and maybe survive for a turn. It's a lot to ask, though. Corsair on top of his deck. He can go to 5 off this land drop, but there is 6 power in the air on Reid's side. So Joe will need something like Siege Rhino, perhaps, to even survive 1 more turn.
The problem is there's 2 dimensions to Reid's attack right now. It's not just about finding 1 answer. Well,
this is one way to answer it, though. Ugin, Reid has the disdainful stroke, though. And that's game 3 going over to Reid, too.
I think Joe might have shook the hands. Yeah. Reid was like, no, I think it's not 2 out of 3 here. It's best of 5.
And for Reid, turns it aggressive.
And Reid's sideboard doing a ton of work here. What's nice about his sideboard is that a lot of what he brings in, well, not a lot of it, but a lot of it interacts very well with his graveyard, for example. The Treasure Cruise is very sweet. The Farika that we saw in game 2 that played a huge role. And the 1 copy of Disdainful Stroke along with the 1 copy of Negate. Now Reid has answers both with the discard spells to getting those Planeswalkers out of the hand preemptively, and if they're on the stack, as you just saw, he has some answers there as well.
Yeah, players taking a break before they shuffle up and start game 4. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Reid has won both the sideboarded games so far, and just needs 1 more of them to make it into the top 4.
Well, his deck is less, it's less of a system of interlocking pieces. When we see him playing game 1, his deck is all about just jamming Whip of Erebos, trying to get good stuff going out of his graveyard. And so in those games, he's very susceptible to his Whip of Erebos not being drawn or being discarded, and the sweepers are problematic for him to plow through. Just look at his sideboard cards. There's nothing fancy going on here. You're looking at Treasure Cruise, Negate, Disdainful Stroke, Thoughtseize, Duress. So he gets to take out some of his stuff that is predicated on his graveyard being available or whatever else is situational and just have good stuff. And games 2 and 3, Whip of Erebos was important, certainly in game 3. And in game 2, it was the card that generated a concession, though I don't think he really needed it. But you can tell his game plan isn't about that. If Whip of Erebos happens to stick and goes uncontested, that's great. And that's probably going to be a pretty easy win for Reid. But he can go to this value plan that he doesn't have access to game 1.
All right, well, we're going to take a short break as the players get ready for their final lat 2 games. Right now, watching the quarterfinals of the Star City Games Richmond Invitational. Stay tuned. We're going to finish the match in just a few.
The goblins were relentless, thousands rising from cracks in the ground. We set bow and blade and beast against them, but not all were so fortunate. Had the goblins left their king at home, we might have lost everything.
Get these paired playmats only at the StarCityGames.com Spring 2015 State Championships, standard on April 11th and modern on April 12th. Visit StarCityGames.com/states to learn more. SCG Live is brought to you by StarCityGames.com, where you can now order Dragons of Tarkir boxes, cases, fat packs, and more. With great prices, excellent customer service, and the world's largest Magic the Gathering singles inventory, StarCityGames.com is your one-stop shop for all your Magic the Gathering needs. Visit us on the web at StarCityGames.com and order Dragons of Tarkir today. Join us on the road to the StarCityGames.com Players Championship in Syracuse, New York on April 4th. With a $20,000 Standard Open and 2 $5,000 Premier Invitational qualifiers featuring Legacy and Modern, the Open Series is paying out more than ever before. 16 players will qualify for any of the next 4 StarCityGames.com Invitationals, where they'll battle for $50,000 in cash prizes and a coveted seat in our year-end Players Championship. Join us to compete, trade, play side events, or just hang out with friends at the StarCityGames.com Open Series in Syracuse.
Meet the StarCityGames.com Winter 2015 Creature Collection. We are proud to debut 4 brand new designs, including the Mammoth, Wolf, and Rat, plus our card parody, Eternal Witness. All are now available on card sleeves, playmats, and dice bags. Get your Winter 2015 Creature Collection products now, exclusively at StarCityGames.com.
StarCityGames.com is proud to offer Cardboard Crack books online and at all of our events. The popular webcomic is now available in 4 books, including the newest, Cardboard Crack Until the Day I Die, all featuring comics not published online. Each volume of more than 100 comics is just $12.99. Visit StarCityGames.com and get your copies of Cardboard Crack today. StarCityGames.com is proud to present Game Night each week at participating stores, this month featuring the Rat Creature Collection. Every game night is a fun and friendly event offering 2 pins and 8 foils you can't get anywhere else. Find a game night near you at StarCityGames.com/game night or tell your local store owner to get involved today. Game Night, where magic happens.
This is fun! Goblins to climb and fight! Bring me tasty beasts! And a few to carry my throne! When you're the king, war is easy.
Get these paired playmats only at the StarCityGames.com Spring 2015 State Championships, standard on April 11th and modern on April 12th. Visit StarCityGames.com/states to learn more. StarCityGames.com is excited to announce Pop Vinyl Planeswalker figures are back in stock. These incredibly popular and super stylized figurines bear the likeness of Magic's iconic Planeswalkers and are available starting at just $9.99 for a limited time. The first shipment of these highly collectible figures flew off the shelves, so order your Jace, Garruk, Chandra, Liliana, Ajani, and Nissa today.
All right, welcome back here to the Star City Games Invitational. Our conclusion of the match between Joe Bass and Reid Duke. It has been quite the match so far. Game one was the long, drawn-out affair. Eventually, Joe Bass winning it by grinding his way through Reid's threats, but the last two games have been more problematic. The second one, Reid was able to maneuver and hang on, whereas the third one, a quick Hornet Queen spelled at the end of the game.
Yeah, Reid's sideboard and being a little bit normalized here. Not that he's gone away entirely from his graveyard synergies, but just bringing in good stuff, discard spells, counter spells, card drawers, just things that are well suited for an attrition battle. And he's been able to fend off some of Joe's bigger plays, which he can't really do in the first game. We saw Disable Stroke on Ugin there to end that game. Game one, Ugin was the thing that ultimately spelled doom for Reid, and that's the big difference between the pre- and post-board games.
All right, well, we are ready for game four. The players have kept on 7, so we'll bring you into the match. This is Bass and Duke. You see Reid Duke up 2-1, but it is a best of 5. Joe will need both of these remaining games if he wants to go to the top 4. With that, we're underway. Joe starting with Temples. These early game turns have really been about trading just land drops. Last game, we actually saw Joe keep a very reasonable hand, multiple copies of his draw 2 spells, some early disruption, but the fact that really games 2 and 3, he has not had an answer to Hornet Queen has really just gotten him.
And Reid's opening was, you know, very, very little. I mean, it was caryatid and lands in hand at some point against Joe that had a lot of card drawers.
Yeah, it was really just playing, he really just cast Hornet Queen on 6.
Torn Elemental plus Whip of Erebos was also problematic.
Both players trading some tap lands. And Joe is going to start with Reid the Bones just on turn 3. So we see here the power of these draw 2s, 6 of them in his deck. Really do help him in this matchup.
So the card drawing is very good for Joe. Reid's not putting him under any pressure. It's a long matchup. But at the end of the day, Joe only has so many cards that matter. And you even see that some of his planeswalkers, like Liliana Vess, like Garruk, they're okay, but Reid can power through that kind of stuff. Both times, you know, those cards have showed up, and in the post-board games, Reid's been able to beat them. So the card drawing is good, but when Joe's just drawing removal spells and Siege Rhinos, Reid can beat that stuff. It's really the Ugin that's cause for concern.
All right, Courser of Kruvix from Reid, that's some card drawing of his own. On Joe's side, he'll play his own Courser, flips Murder's Cut off the top. Does have more lands in his hand, was hoping to get a free card there. Now, what's interesting here is Reid's Courser has shown his one of Hornet Queen again, and this is the card that Joe has lost to both games. We'll see if he can find an answer for it game 3.
And Joe already has the Ugin in his hand, which is good news and bad news. It means that he may have access to it on turn 8, The bad news is that Reid has a lot of discard spells, and if that gets tagged, as we've seen, the other powerful elements of Joe's deck, Reid can beat straight up. He doesn't need to do something crazy out of his graveyard. He can just be casting his threats, whipping back some good stuff. He can plow through the other planeswalkers.
Reid with 4th land here, gaining a life, and he'll pass. Both players just setting up for that endgame fight. It's going to be Joe that gets his first free land off Courser. Plays a Temple, showing Windswept Heath, putting that to the bottom. So he does have one answer in Ugin for Hornet Queen. We'll see if he has something else. Elspeth Sun's Champion, his draw next turn. It will be his 6th turn, so he should be able to cast it on curve.
And Joe is likely to just fire it off, I believe, because if he has a untapped land ready to go, because it's very powerful if the board's not contested, and if it eats a negate or a disdainful stroke, Joe is thrilled, because the whole point here is to try to set up for that Ugin.
For Reid, it's just more life points. Second copy of Courser of Krufix, then plays a land out of his hand. He goes up to 23. He does have Whip of Erebos on top of his deck as well. After that, Joe will end step Abzan Charm. That's his second draw 2 here. Draws Elspeth, draws Tasigur. Top card is Caves of Koilos. Can he get another free land off Courser? He sure can, but it comes into play tapped. He may just go for that Elspeth here.
Yeah, particularly if he doesn't do anything, I think he's looking at discarding a hand size anyway.
Yeah, both Elspeth and Ugin in his hand. I believe Reid with a copy of Disdainful Stroke.
But I don't mind Elspeth as a test spell here when you have Ugin in hand. Because Reid can also just beat an Elspeth by saying it resolves, untap, and downfall it. The 3 tokens aren't worth a whole lot in this matchup.
Yep, here's the try for Elspeth. Reid will Disdainful Stroke it. So you're saying right here is it's unlikely that Reid has Hero's Downfall?
Probably not, unless he has something really specific to do with his mana next turn, because 3 tokens is just, I mean, it sort of matters, but not really.
Draws Whip of Erebos for Reid. Flips his top card, Satyr Wayfinder. He has yet to get a free land off his Coursers.
And so far, so good here from Joe's side of the table. He's got one of Reid's 2 counterspells, and those are very precious tools for Reid. There's nothing going on in his graveyard right now for that Whip of Erebos, and this is shaping out to be the sort of game where Reid beating an Ugin or even beating an End hostilities might be problematic.
Yeah, you see Reid's hand. It's 2 more lands. One of them is a Temple, a Whip of Erebos, a Hornet Queen, and one of his copies of Tasigur. So if he could play his Tasigur this turn, I think that's the option he's weighing.
Well, the problem is Reid's in this weird kind of bind where he wants to add to his board, but adding to his board is very risky because of the sweepers. But the way things are going right now, Joe's getting the better end of this sort of card advantage and buildup of resources exchange as you see here.
So he's going to add to the board, but in the form of Whip of Erebos. So plays that, swings both coursers. They'll gain life, so Reid will gain 4. Joe will take 2. Reid, so 27 and 17.
And this is a way for Reid to do something with his mana without committing further into a potential sweeper.
And you see Reid playing a Temple for the turn, and now that he has the Whip in play, it decides to keep Satyr Wayfinder on top of his deck. Joe draws, gets another free land off that Courser. It's land 7, shows Caves of Koilos on top. Doesn't want that one. Remember, Joe does have that Ugin, though, once he hits 1 more land.
And I think what Joe would like to do is, if he can get the Whip off the table this turn, that's very, very good, as Reid's drawing a Satyr Wayfinder that's not particularly good without the Whip, and also might compel Reid to just tap out to put some stuff into play, and then Ugin can be a backbreaker.
Well, the strength of Ugin here is Ugin can come down and exile Reid's whole board and still have enough counters left to get all the tokens off Hornet Queen.
Yeah.
And here is going to be Tasigur from Joe, pacing this so that now that he has finally cast it, he will have 4 mana up to immediately use it. You see him delving away everything but the Elspeth. There will be a Hero's Downfall on top of his deck, so Reid won't be forced to give Joe the Elspeth, but giving him the Downfall still is probably a win in Joe's book.
Yeah, just trying to get to the spot, make the board harder and harder for Reid to advance on without tapping out for a big thing. There's also the possibility that Reid just doesn't find anything good with this Wayfinder, and then he's back in the spot where he has to be adding to the board.
See Reid playing Satyr Wayfinder here, and just looking at his sequencing, had a free land on top of the deck, but decided to not cast it first, and he mills a copy of Tassiger and another copy of Satyr Wayfinder, and then takes the Landmore Wastes. Hero's Downfall is his next card. So your creatures in Reid's graveyard are just 2, Tassiger and Satyr Wayfinder. Looks like he's gonna whip back the Satyr Wayfinder. Just
trying to find, just churn over here, get more stuff going.
Mills away that Hero's Downfall. Mills is a carry-added, a Sidisi, and the other Sidisi. That was a much better Satyr Wayfinder for him, even though it didn't hit the land.
The problem now is the shields are down. Before, Joe would have respected the possibility of negate being in Reid's hand, may have tried to do something with his turn other than land Ugin, but now the coast is clear.
Seems hard to pass up that option.
This is I mean, Reid's going to lose a lot. Joe's going to be left over with the Tassiger and the Ugin with counters.
Oh yeah, the Ugin won't even get rid of the Tassiger. This is a great turn for Joe.
Right.
You see Ugin milling 2, or Tassiger milling 2, so 2 Elspeths and a Hero's Downfall in the graveyard. Reid gets to give one of them back to Joe. See how worried he is about the Planeswalker.
You have some incentive to give him the Elspeth to start off with, because then you can give him the redundant Elspeth on the second activation if that comes up. But this is bad news for Reid. I think, you know, he needed to get something going with his graveyard because he had nothing going on here. And it's just the one Ugin. It's not like Joe's siding into more copies. But this line of play from Reid leaves him very exposed. Joe doesn't even have to respect the possibility of a counterspell now.
His draw for the turn is Reid the Bones, a top card. That's the untapped land he needs. Caves of Koilos into play, Joe up to 19. And this is going to be quite the play. 8 mana, here's Ugin. -4 on Ugin will exile all of Reid's permanents. Well, non-land permanents. Whip's gone, Coursers are gone. Satyr Wayfinder's gone, Tassiger remains. It swings for 4, Reid's at 28.
Now, the downfall on the top of his deck means that Reid can get out from this spot in an immediate sense, but that's his, I mean, he can't downfall and play Hornet Queen in the same turn, so then he's on another turn delay. Joe might be able to find a discard spell, or just have enough removal where he doesn't particularly care about Hornet Queen. Joe also has Elspeth in hand, and Elspeth is fine at racing Hornet Queen if Joe is able to get his Elspeth into play first.
Reid does have a lot of life points to work with, though, so these initial hits off Tassiger won't hurt as much.
He does have time,
downfall.
but Joe's got a 7-card hand.
Yeah, Joe actually had an 8-card hand. He had to discard his copy of Urborg there at the end of turn.
Yeah, just the raw resource count right now is heavily in Joe's favor.
Yeah, this has really been the story. In the games that have gone Joe's way, Ugin has carried it for him. In the games that have gone Reid's way, it's been Hornet Queen. Kind of which card can go over the top of the other person's deck.
Yeah, Ugin is the trump in the matchup. Is the best card either player brings to the table. I think once you get past Ugin, the second best card, the third best card, the fourth best card, I think they're all in Reid's deck, but Joe has the best one.
That is the Spirit Dragon. So on Reid's side, he will play Tassiger, delving away everything but the Hero's Downfalls. Needs to take care of that Ugin. Now he'll mill 2. Can he draw a get a Hero's Downfall's hand? He gets either a Downfall or a Treasure Cruise. Joe will give Reid the Downfall. And looks like Ugin might stick around for turn. I don't know, not positive here. Reid, does he? Did he already? Is this his second Hero's Downfall or his first?
He has 2 downfalls in hand currently.
So 2 downfalls on Hornet Queen. Got that second one there. It means he has an answer to Elspeth as well. But just the resource game favoring Joe. And Reid will pass here. And he'll let Joe draw. He'll give him the activation for off Ugin.
I mean, it is just a bolt. I am not positive what Reid is holding this downfall. I mean, there's a Tassiger in play and Elspeth that he knows about, but
Ugin will send 3 damage to Reid. He's down to 25. I suppose that 3 damage is not particularly significant here. I mean, maybe Reid wants to, like, maybe the more reasonable downfall target is Tassiger at this point, if he thinks he can get the Ugin off the board other ways.
yes. That's a spot where I think I would have preferred Joe to just move into combat and attack with the Tassiger, because then the threat of the Ugin would prevent Reid from blocking, and then you can bolt post-combat. Unless you think Reid's giving you the option to attack and then will downfall your Ugin inside of combat, which seems like a very weird line of play. It's possible Joe is already committed to just killing this Tassiger with some removal spell, and it doesn't really matter very much. Does not want to give Reid priority to change his mind and kill the Ugin.
What a great spot for Joe. 7-card hand, casts Reid the Bones for the turn. Just staying so full on resources. He's scrying to the bottom with Tempo. A lot of weapons in hand here for Joe Bass. Ugin will eventually get that hero's downfall. We see Joe has copies of Utter End, Elspeth. And while Reid's tapped down, he will Utter End away the Tassiger.
And that Utter End is precious because there's a lot of, obviously, graveyard shenanigans going on in Reid's deck. And with an Abzan Charm in hand, I wonder if that was just a concession to mana efficiency more than anything else.
Yeah, with those Utter Ends, there's limited resource ways that Joe can deal with cards like Whip of Erebos and Pharika. His answers are the Utter End, the Ugin, and the Erase. So he's used 2 of them. So he only has the Erase left. So it means that if Reid gets both the Pharika and the Whip, one of them will stick. On Reid's turn, it's going to be Hornet Queen. This is how he's won the last 2 games. Will it be good enough? This is going to be the real test. Joe has a lot of cards.
And we've never seen him Bile-Blight in the post-board games. That has not come up yet.
Yeah, no, his sweepers in post-board games have just been Ugin and End Hostilities. No Drown in Sorrow, no Bile-Blight. Does he have one yet? He's going to Thoughtseize Reid. Reid with just 2 cards, gets the hero's downfall, leaving Reid with just an Opulent Palace. If Joe can answer this Hornet Queen, his Tassiger and really 7 cards in hand should carry the day.
I mean, he may be able just to race with Siege Rhinos at this stage. It would be good for him to be able to get the Hornets off the table. That might not be necessary.
Yeah, well, he'll start with Siege Rhino, as you mentioned there. +3, Joe's up to 16, Reid down to 21. We know he has an Elspeth in hand as well. At this point, Tassiger will probably just get him back cards like Thoughtseize. And a great draw from Reid. It's Duress, but redundancy in Joe's hand. Not 1 Elspeth, but 2 to go with the Erase.
So Joe at this point is on the damage race plan, hope to overpower with Elspeths, hope to draw something big.
Right now, it looks like that may work.
Yeah, I think that Joe's got enough life points to play with. Reid still has to leave some stuff back on defense because he doesn't want to be taking 4 damage from the Tassiger. He's going to be able to deploy Elspeth at least once. That's probably going to absorb a turn of attacking from Reid, possibly more. He's going to be able to activate Tassiger. I mean, this is not a direct answer to Hornet Queen, but it looks like Joe's generated enough of a resource advantage over the last couple of turns that he may be able to slog through it. And if he ever finds a straight-up answer, then things are very, very easy for him.
Now, this is an interesting choice for Reid. Obviously, Joe will get one of these Elspeths and we'll play it next turn. Reid can take the Erase, which means a possible Whip of Erebos top deck or a Pharika top deck could be very good for Reid. However, the second Elspeth is not without value here. If Reid is planning to attack down the first Elspeth with Hornets, he can't let Joe have the second one.
Yeah.
You see, we'll take the redundant copy of Elspeth, which I think makes sense. Reid's right now the only cards that could be erased, those Whips and Pharikas don't seem particularly good draws for Reid, so that he doesn't really care about protecting them.
So Reid not trying to hold back anything at all. He's willing to accept the Tassiger inside of combat here, sending every single Hornet.
Six damage there puts Joe down to 10. Reid doing the math here. Joe's swing will be for 8 and then for 11. So here's a swing for 8. Reid down to 13. Land from Joe. Here's Elspeth.
And if Reid's leaving nothing back, I suspect his plan here is just ignore Elspeth and try to close the game out in 2 turns.
We look at it, with 6 damage a turn, Reid does have a 2-turn clock. Joe's clock is still only 2 turns. He only has 11 points of power in play. That's not 13. If both players just draw nothing, Reid will win first.
And Joe's Tassiker here is not worth very much because there's some nonsense in the graveyard to give back.
Yeah, thoughts. Well, there's one piece of nonsense. So the Thoughtseize he can give back, but I think after that he can't. He can give Joe an Utter End, actually.
Elspeth is also, the second Elspeth's also fine.
So yeah, those Tasker activations, not, you're right, not worth too much.
I mean, this is a risky line of play from Reid, but I don't think that he can win long at this point, or he would have to draw very, very well. Trying to shorten up the game and saying, you miss a couple draw steps, the Tassiker isn't worth very much. I like it as a plan, especially because Joe in these post-board games has not shown Bioblade. He's not shown no obvious answer. And Reid, the die's cast. Reid's got his plan.
Hornet Queen has won the last 2 games for Reid. We'll see if it can win a third. Tassiker from Joe mills 2 cards, but Reid likely to give him a Thoughtseize or an Elspeth. Yeah, here's the Thoughtseize. Something Joe actively just doesn't want to cast. Can Joe draw something like a Siege Rhino? That would certainly get it for him.
And surveying the board here, and it's so important that Reid has sent everything every turn, because now it means not even, if he held back a token 1 turn, let's say, initially,
Then a downfall would do it.
1 removal spell gets Joe out of this.
Joe will Tassiker again. Here's End Hostilities and a land. Well, there's a second Elspeth he could give him. Remember, he can give him 1 downfall. He actually cannot give Joe something like Abzan Charm. The 2 1/1 counters would make it lethal. So you see, yeah, Elspeth and Downfall are the safe cards.
Yeah, my initial implication was, my initial assumption surveying the board was, it's going to be a damage race. Hold back your 1 against his 4. But Reid identified exactly what the clock was going to look like, and it put pressure on Joe to find 2 removal spells over the course of a couple turns.
Traded 1 damage for 4 so that 1 removal spell did not beat him. So Reid giving Joe a second Elspeth. Joe will Tassiker again. Here's the other End Hostilities. A 3rd card. Remember, Joe can... Yeah, gets another Elspeth off it. And here's the whole team swinging. This is 11 damage. Reid's at 2. Elspeth pluses to make soldiers, but this may just be it. 4th land for Joe. He did not play a Siege Rhino. And without a Rhino there, this attack looks to be lethal.
And I mean, Joe showed that he had nothing. He's been spinning his tires there, activating Tassiker that turn instead of advancing his board. I mean, again, the die is cast.
Here's a swing. Murderous Cut takes down Hornet Queen, but no second kill spell. And it's going to be 3 games to 1. Reid Duke and Hornet Queen moving on to the top 4.
So Joe is at exactly 16 at the spot where Reid decides to make his call about how to play out the rest of that game. If Joe's at 17 or if Joe's at 15, it's possible that Reid takes different lines of play. The fact that he was exactly at 16 meant that if he attacks with everything every turn, he can beat 1 removal spell and force Joe to find a Siege Rhino, a Sweeper, or something. And that is just the workmanlike, everyday brilliance of Reid Duke, being able to assess in that spot where it looks so attractive to leave back 1 of your tokens. And that was my initial instinct too, because it looks like it's going to be a damage race, and you don't want to be taking the Tassiker
1 to 4 sounds really bad in a damage race,
unless
you do the tactics on it.
The life totals were pretty close to even in the spot that they got into, but Reid saw that what Joe's hand was, said, you know, he has to draw 2 removal spells over the course of the 2 turns or get pretty lucky with these Tassiker hits or something to be